Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of the International Cannabis Conversation. I am your host, Chris Day, co-founder of the Global Cannabis Network Collective, and your happy to travel the world with you host to talk about the global cannabis markets. I don't get a chance every week to thank the production team at Trichomes. They're great in helping us to coordinate all of these guests from different time zones around the world. And I also feel compelled to do a shout out to my friend and amazing jazz musician, Noah Peterson, for letting me use his music as an intro and outro to the show every week. Great guy, currently based in San Antonio, Texas. So if you get a chance to listen to Noah's music or see him live in concert, you should check him out. One of the great cultural definers around the world is music, and it's one of my passions. And it's interesting as we talk about different elements of culture, whether it's related to cannabis, wellness, food, music, all of these things really help to define a marketplace. And today, as we delve into talking to a great guest who really has successfully taken a company to have a global footprint, we're going to talk about some of what defines these individual markets that they're operating in. Clever Leaves is this multinational cannabis company. They've got an emphasis on ecologically sustainable, large-scale cultivation and pharmaceutical-grade processing. They have operations and investments in the United States, Canada, Colombia, Germany, and Portugal. And Clever Leaves has created an effective distribution network with a global footprint. They are focused really on sustainability, capital efficiency, and rapid growth. And I am honored to have with us today the CEO of Clever Leaves, Kyle Detwiler. Kyle, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, of course. Hey, I need to congratulate you because not very often in a cannabis company bio do I get to read the words capital efficiency. It's not generally something somebody puts directly in there, but something that's really important. And I have to assume that part of the reason it's there is because of your background in finance and investment. But I thought we might want to introduce to the audience a little bit about you and what that background really is that's led to descriptions like that in a multinational cannabis company. So tell us a little bit about sort of where you come from.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a small town in South Dakota where I was around farming for most of my life. But on my professional side, I spent most of my career at KKR and the Blackstone Group, two very large private equity firms. Focused my time largely in the natural resource space, so sugarcane, coal, iron ore, wheat, that sort of thing, and also in the healthcare space. And in the healthcare space, spent a significant amount of that time in pharmaceuticals. And in pharmaceuticals, the push is really to get to a low-cost, high-quality outcome delivered for patients. I mean, that's what generic pharmaceutical companies are all about. And on the natural resource side, when you're talking about things like blueberries, asparagus, or sugar, everybody's trying to flock to the equator where you have year-round growing conditions that don't vary, so there's no seasonality, and there's also a better carbon footprint. And so really the journey of time at KKR and Blackstone helped lead me to cannabis because, kind of cannabis, I saw the opportunity to combine those two lessons. There wasn't a low cost, cannabis company when we started in the industry. Just like, 50 years ago, I think it was a crazy idea for Americans to go buy their, pharmaceuticals, and have them made in China or India. But today, you walk down the CVS aisle and that's what you see. It's made in India, made in Israel, made in China. And so that's kind of the big picture idea, and my background that led to it.
Yeah, that's great. I know I hadn't well, I had thought, I guess, sort of separately about the equatorial locations and how that helps, but I assume then that also translates pretty directly into why you guys expanded also into Portugal and the cultivation processes there. How has that gone? Because I honestly haven't had much conversation with people that have a footprint in Portugal, and I'm just curious, sort of, what the dynamic is over there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, and I think we had a similar experience. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I'd say, I could probably pull together 50 PowerPoint decks that I had received from others, looking to go after Europe. And I think when you fast forward to today, there are probably not 50 that I could that are named that are active. But you have to think that everything we do at Clever Leaves is almost backwards to the way that most of the industry has approached things. We never wanted to build production in Canada or the United States, right? It doesn't make ecological or environmental sense to do it. And so we always studied where these other botanical agricultural products came from. Colombia was a winner because that's where red roses come from. 7 in 10 cut flowers brought into the United States come from Colombia. And then when you move over to Europe, and it's important to recognize that Colombia doesn't allow us to export dried flower products yet, composed of cannabis. So we needed another location to do that. And if you go to Europe, we looked at Greece, Macedonia, and Germany, and France, and the UK, and we can go on and on. There's both a patchwork of what's legal. So many countries cannabis is not allowed, and in certain geographies you also don't have a very good rule of law, no good. Investors are nervous about investing in countries like Greece and Macedonia, and Portugal is sort of the hub of Western European agriculture. You see a lot of berries that are produced there, a lot of olive oil, which is actually later stamped as made in Italy, is actually produced in Portugal. And the environment for growing is great. The government is supportive. It was one of the few places early on that was pushing it, and also could be one of the first countries to have a recreational program in place. So we said, oh wait, this is perfect. Colombia will become our hub for very complicated pharmaceutical preparations, extractions, isolates, and Portugal will be that beautiful flower product that is still a big part of most cannabis markets, whether medical or adult use.
Yep, that's great. And it makes sense, as you mentioned the roses in Colombia. I had the chance on my last trip there in 2019 to also tour the big convention center that was there. And at the time, they were having one of the largest flower shows in South America. And we were talking about how to integrate into that in the future, some discussion around cannabis. But yeah, you're right. It's truly phenomenal. Has nothing to do with what we're talking here, except the relevance of agriculture. But it was pretty spectacular to see that and sort of how those markets developed there. When you're looking at the multinational aspect, picking and choosing these markets for efficiency, and then circling back to, the mention of capital efficiency, I feel like we've recently entered a fairly new era in cannabis where you've seen a lot of the early sort of large scale investments really prove out that there was a lot of overreach, and, the expenses weren't necessarily justifying the market at the time. And I'm wondering how you all are approaching this to ensure that Clever Leaves continues to be able to expand and grow, continues to serve its markets, but doesn't end up in some of the holes that some of the other sort of multinational operators have ended up in.
No, it's a good observation, and I think you could have told me. And one of the reasons we started looking in Colombia in 2016 was because we were up in Canada in February, where it was snowing, it was dark most of the time, and we said, why are people trying to build greenhouses up here? This makes absolutely no sense. But it took people about 5 years to realize, you're right, you should not build greenhouses where it snows so much, right? But some of that foolishness is still going on.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at I mean, one of the first cannabis cultivation facilities in the state of New York was in Queens, right? I mean, it's just a recipe for disaster as well. Um, there's some pretty interesting studies that have now been put out that, if you looked at, the carbon cycle for cultivating an ounce of cannabis, it may consume as much carbon or emit as much carbon as a car's gas tank, like a full tank of gas. Then there's some interesting statistics saying that, nearly half of the growth of the power grid in Colorado over the last 5 or so years is coming from cannabis cultivation. I saw another statistic yesterday, which was that 10% of Massachusetts industrial electrical usage is coming from cannabis. So it's not like the craziness has stopped, right? There's still a lot of folly, and part of it's imposed by these regulations that are throughout the U.S. or throughout the world. But Clever Leaves is trying to just look past that. Right? Okay, we get it. There are some anachronisms in the way that regulation works, and in 5 years this won't exist. People will suddenly realize in 5 years, you know what, we probably shouldn't grow cannabis in an old yarn factory in Massachusetts, right? That will eventually evolve, and people will say, what's the carbon intensity? How organic is this production? Is this good for the environment besides just getting me high? Like every other consumer good on earth. So I think the real time to shine for Clever Leaves will be in the future. And in the meantime, it's a little bit unfortunate, but we also face a higher regulatory bar. It is not easy to move cannabis from Colombia for the very first time into countries like Canada, the U.S., Europe, Southeast Asia, Israel, and Portugal as well. I mean, just imagine, the first time you come up to the airport and there's a baggage handler working at United or Lufthansa, and you hand him a 10-kilogram box of cannabis. What are they going to do? There's a process for this that has to get sort of discovered, and it takes some time. And I think Clever Leaves is pioneering, how this industry will.
Yeah, I think all of us who are in the cannabis industry, who travel extensively internationally, know just how friendly, shall we say, people become when you show up on those lists and are carrying nothing, let alone if you're trying to actually move, legal product through the system. So, you mentioned bringing product from Colombia into the United States, and I am excited to be talking about this because I think it starts to redefine a long-lasting relationship that hasn't always been through the best light between product flows from Colombia to the US. And you all just announced this amazing project. I think it's called Project Changes Lives, with a dedication to donate $25 million worth of product to research in the United States. How did that come about? I think it's phenomenal, by the way. I'm really excited to see where that leads, because we know the product that's been, looked at and researched here over the last 20 years is not the best marker for success. So how did this come along?
Well, the first thing we had to do was make sure we could deliver it. And for the past years, I mean, we didn't put, we don't spill all of our special recipes out to the public, but we've been building a pattern, right? We are the first company to ever export legal cannabis from the country of Colombia. We got it into Canada. We then have spread it out to now to 15 countries. We eventually brought it into the United States. So we worked hand in hand with former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle and his team to help figure out what would be the path to get a Schedule 1 substance like cannabis in. And we've partnered up with Schedule 1 DEA certified labs. And so, all perfectly legal with permits. We created that piping, and then said, okay, great. Now that the piping works, right? Nobody's come out of the woodworks and said, hey, I want to take that product and move it into the research side of the equation. And I think most of that is because there isn't really a research community yet around cannabis. And where does that problem stem? I think you identified it as the fact that there's only really one federally authorized source to produce it in the United States, which is the University of Mississippi. And bless their hearts, They only produce flower products, right? They don't produce any extract products. And, based on the limitations of their genetics capabilities, the THC potency in that product doesn't get to where, it would be, in terms of a commercial product in a dispensary in Colorado, for example. So we said, well, this is perfect. Beyond that need for the product, there's also a very glaring question of find me 1 kilogram of product produced in the United States that's been inspected by the FDA or certified to European pharmaceutical standards. There is 0. So,
Right.
The big question that I have as legalization approaches, or why hasn't Pfizer kind of done a partnership with an MSO, is because those production systems aren't built to be pharmaceutical grade. And that's because they're scattered across, 17 different states with 17 different management teams, and also running a GMP facility is pretty expensive. And that comes back to the fashion forward thinking for Clever Leaves is, okay, great. We built that in Colombia. We have 2 million square feet of production. We have a pharmaceutical lab. It doesn't use hydrocarbon extraction, because find me another pharmaceutical company that will put an explosive next to an ingredient that they're trying to make. It's all CO2, right? It was built for that. And we are now one of what I estimate to be 3 companies on the planet that are EU GMP certified, both in cultivation and extraction, to create an integrated solution. Okay, so we've got the supply problem, but now we have to get researchers excited. And it's really tough for cannabis to get money to fund that research, to even get an academic board to approve it. And so he said, let's take money of the cost of that product off the table. Clever Leaves will give it away. We are asking for nothing back from researchers. There is no monetary, expectation. And, that ought to help trigger sort of a cannabis revolution. And, I am an American. I am, calling in here from Florida. I would hate to see the American cannabis industry just think that the only way to give people the benefits of cannabis is a gummy and a vape pen, right? There is something more here. And if we don't start doing that research, other countries will get ahead and leave the U.S. behind.
Yeah, I at the GCNC we launched about a month ago a science panel, which internally we have scientists from 5 different continents, all who regularly track what kind of research is being done around the world, and working to consolidate that sort of in quarterly one sheets, so that we can just show people what's happening in other parts of the world around research and science, and that there is indeed active, trustworthy science program and research programs going on. And sadly, there is not a researcher from the U.S. that is actively doing a lot of their research in the U.S. We have Dr. Russo, who's out of Seattle, but a lot of that research that they're doing is overseas because of what you just said. It's just not viable, or hasn't been viable heretofore for a lot of them. So I'm excited to see where that goes. Offline, we should talk about who you are looking to work with in that space, because I'd love to fill that gap. I would love to say, here are multiple scientists in the United States and Europe and Australia and Asia, all working together to inform the public around the world about, the various benefits and challenges, frankly, of the product. So kudos to Clever Leaves for doing it. I'm sure in the long run, it will also pay off as legalization happens, having sort of those trusted relationships with the government. But in the meantime, also just from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, it's great to see somebody stand up and do that here. So I love it. I'll continue to promote it as much as I can, because it's one of the huge missing links for the North American market. You've talked about overcoming a lot of challenges, navigating a lot of different restrictions around the world. I always like to lay out in these shows not only the great opportunity, but also some of the barriers that people have overcome. Which barriers have really caused the most challenge for you all, and required, I guess, some of the most creative solutions as you've continued to try and build Clever Leaves out?
Yeah, well, geez, I'm not sure if there's a part of our business where I could say there was something easy. Everything was tricky. I mean, just over my shoulder, for example, this you might be wondering, why do I have a cardboard box framed that says Department of Homeland Security evidence written on it? And that is the box in which our first commercial shipment, not for research purposes, our first commercial shipment of CBD produced in Colombia was sent to the United States. And when 4 kilograms of product shows up in plastic pharmaceutical kind of containers, but is a white powder from Colombia, there's only so much a customs agent can do but to hold themselves back and think about trying to inspect that. And I would like to think, why don't people treat this just like any other pharmaceutical product, right? If this was ground up aspirin coming from Southeast Asia, I'd like to think there would be a protocol, but let's be realistic. We live in the modern world. This is happening for the first time. People aren't used to cannabis coming across. People don't know the name Clever Leaves like they would, Pfizer or something like that. So those are some of the challenges that we have to work through. We talked about the airlines. Believe it or not, airlines have policies when it comes down to cannabis. I think when I last looked at this, about a third of airlines hadn't made up their mind about cannabis. A third were explicitly not shipping cannabis, and that included CBD. And then the third would potentially do it under certain exceptions. Now you have to hope that those airlines line up with the countries or the cities that you're going to send something from, because we can't take a Bogota to Texas to Sydney flight if that contains psychoactive cannabis, because that's a whole different set of permits and licenses that we have to have. So could it go from Bogota to Canada and then down to Sydney? Okay, well that could potentially work, for example. So I mean, I could definitely go on about lots of different things, but I've been always intrigued by how complicated the logistics of this can be.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with a representative from the Montevideo airport in Uruguay, because they were trying very hard to sort of create a hub there to help companies in South America create sort of an easier logistical path to places like Australia over to Europe. But it was still very much in development. It reminds me I need to circle back with them and see how that's going. But I think, we talk about product niches and geographic markets. I think as we continue to see cannabis become a global product, shipping around the world, we're going to find a lot of supply chain niches for companies to help facilitate all of that. Just the paperwork alone is outstanding. So I would guess there's going to be a lot of opportunity for folks to continue to expand in that kind of business as well. So one question I always like to close with is, it's the crystal ball question, right? So as you polish off the crystal ball and you look 2 to 5 years down the road, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for Clever Leaves? Where are you, trying to guide the company into, whether it's new markets, new product lines, or just sort of building out existing spaces? What does that look like in the next 24 months to 5 years for you?
Well, the main thing we do today is, we're trying to solidify partnerships, and these partnerships can take, there's probably a year of dancing and flirting and dating and trying to figure out, whether Clever Leaves is a good match for, company XYZ. Once you kind of reach that point, then there's a whole nother year that generally gets spent in, okay, what exactly do we want? Do we want a 10% CBD product, a 15% product, a 5% product? Do we want 0.2% THC? Can we live with 0.9% THC? Does that need to be GMP certified? Does it need to be GMP compliant? There's a lot of that goes on. And so for the next 2 years, I think people are going to see the work that's been going on for the last 5 about announcing partnerships with companies. We've brought a major pharma company on from Europe. I think we have major pharma companies in other parts of the world that we hope to announce. Then the next part is actually, okay, 2 years worth of fancy work just to sign a piece of paper. Now let's ship some product, right? Let's treat some patients. And so that is really going to take shape over the next 2 years. In the backdrop, while I can't control it, I expect the U.S. to legalize. That will be a big moment. I think the way in which it will legalize will really astound people. I don't think people have really grasped. I think you still have people debating at cannabis conferences whether or not there will be interstate commerce, for example. Never do I hear a conversation about, will we have to compete with imports? And lo and behold, I'm pretty sure you will have to compete with imports.
You will.
Because we're bringing product in already today. So that's a big moment. I think another big question is, will Europe begin to open up a recreational experiment, right? I think we're going to see the Netherlands turn online and a couple other kind of smaller markets. If Europeans, which, make decisions on different timelines and, each country kind of has its own say in different languages and have different societal perceptions. I think if that starts to happen, you could really see an explosion in Europe. I think when Curaleaf acquired another one of the peer companies in Portugal, a company called EMAC, Boris had said on one of their earnings calls that what I see in Europe today is what I see in the U.S. industry in 2017. The market value of EMAC was about the same value of Curaleaf at that period of time, but it's so early and there were so few people that understand these markets. And basically back in 2017, I don't know if most people remember this. American cannabis companies were very unpopular. The companies that were popular in 2017 were the Canadians. And so I think if you kind of map that out, in 2 to 4 years, I think a lot of people are saying, wow, I would really love to sell into a country like, Germany or Portugal or France, but, they're not going to have a lot of the framework. It's going to be a lot more pharmaceutical, a lot more regulation involved in sort of the U.S. market. And I don't think people are really have baked that into their expectations. So I think those are a couple of exciting things, but it's cannabis. I say one thing, and tomorrow the exact opposite will almost surely happen, and we'll have to adapt people in this rain or shine.
Yep. No, I appreciate that very much. We've seen things pivot drastically 3 or 4 times just since 2017. And I also emphatically agree with you on the lack of attention being paid to the international markets by U.S. operators as they discuss what legalization looks like. I gave a talk on that just last week, trying to get people to think, yes, within their local markets, but also sort of looking abroad so that they don't get surprised and start creating partnerships and collaboration. So we're on the same page there, Kyle. Hopefully we're right. And we get to see how this all develops. So I want to thank you again for joining us this week. It's great to have you. I'm always grateful to our guests, but I know you're especially busy. And so thanks for carving this out. And to all of you out there in podcast land, thanks for listening to us talk about the global cannabis markets. If you haven't yet subscribed, I really don't know what you're waiting for. Just hit that little button so that you get to hear us talk every week with great guests around the world. This week, Kyle Detwiler, CEO of Clever Leaves, and looking forward to seeing you again next week, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in.